March 17, 1938. A Tuesday morning in Harlem. The kind of morning where the cold still bit through wool coats and the streets smelled like coal smoke in yesterday's rain. Inside a cramped apartment on 139th Street, a woman in her 60s stood at her kitchen sink, washing dishes with hands that had scrubbed floors in white people's homes for 40 years. Her name was Bumpy Johnson. She didn't know that in less than 3 minutes, her son would become the most dangerous man in New York City. She didn't know that the sound of boots on her stairs would set off a chain of events that would leave a decorated police officer catatonic, drooling in a psychiatric ward, begging nurses to protect him from shadows that weren't there. She didn't know that what was about to happen in her kitchen would remind every corrupt cop in Harlem that some lines, once crossed, could never be uncrossed. The knock came hard, 3 pounds that rattled the frame. Mabel dried her hands and opened the door. Officer Patrick Donnelly stood there, 6'2", Irish, with a face like carved granite and a badge that had covered more sins than any priest in the city. He pushed past her without a word. He was looking for her son. He didn't find him. What he did instead, in a moment of casual cruelty that he would replay in his mind 10,000 times before his sanity shattered, was slap Bumpy Johnson across the face so hard her dentures came loose. He called her something no son should ever hear about his mother. Then he walked out, laughing, telling her to tell her boy that the tribute was due. 72 hours later, Patrick Donnelly would be found naked in an alley behind a slaughterhouse in the Bronx, covered in his own filth, screaming about the man in the dark who wouldn't stop whispering his mother's name. The year was 1938, and Harlem was a kingdom built on contradictions. It was jazz and poetry and the Harlem Renaissance still echoing through the streets. It was also violence, heroin, numbers rackets, and white cops who treated black neighborhoods like occupied territory. The police in Harlem didn't serve. They extracted. They shook down shop owners, took cuts from gambling operations, and when someone didn't pay, they made examples. Patrick Donnelly was one of the worst. He'd been on the Harlem beat for 11 years. He had a reputation. He didn't just take bribes, he demanded them with his fists. He'd put 3 men in the hospital over unpaid protection money. He'd beaten a shopkeeper so badly the man lost vision in one eye. And he got away with it because in 1938, a black man's word against a white cop's badge meant nothing. The system protected men like Donnelly. It enabled them. It gave them guns and authority and told them the streets were theirs to control. But the system didn't account for Ellsworth Raymond Johnson. It didn't account for Bumpy. Bumpy Johnson was 31 years old in 1938. He'd been in Harlem for over a decade, and in that time, he'd built something rare. Not just a reputation, not just fear. He'd built respect. He didn't run the biggest operation. That belonged to Stephanie St. Clair and later Dutch Schultz. But Bumpy was the enforcer everyone feared and the strategist everyone respected. He moved through Harlem like a ghost, always 3 steps ahead, always calculating. He didn't talk much, didn't need to. People knew what he was capable of. He'd survived fights that should have killed him. He'd outsmarted cops, gangsters, and mobsters who thought they could muscle into his territory. He protected his people. That was the code. You didn't touch Harlem's own, and you sure as hell didn't touch his family. When Bumpy found out what Donnelly had done, he was sitting in a back room at the Cotton Club, playing cards with 3 men who ran numbers in the Bronx. Someone whispered in his ear. The game stopped. Bumpy didn't say a word. He stood up, folded his cards, and walked out. The men at the table looked at each other. They knew. Everyone in that room knew. Something was coming. Something bad. Bumpy went to see his mother first. She was sitting in her kitchen, a bruise blooming purple across her cheekbone, her lips split. She tried to tell him it was nothing, tried to say she'd tripped. But Bumpy had seen enough violence to know the shape of a slap. He knelt beside her chair, put his hand on hers, and he promised her something that sounded almost gentle. He said it would be handled. She begged him not to do anything, told him it wasn't worth the trouble. But Bumpy wasn't listening anymore. In his mind, the plan was already forming. Cold, methodical, irreversible. Patrick Donnelly had no idea he'd made a mistake. To him, Bumpy Johnson was just another scared black woman in another cramped apartment. He'd slapped her the way you'd swat a fly, thoughtless, automatic. He went back to his precinct, filed some paperwork, and spent the afternoon shaking down a bar owner on Lenox Avenue. That night, he went home to his wife and 2 kids in Queens, kissed them goodnight, drank a beer, watched the radio. He slept well. The first sign that something was wrong came the next morning. Donnelly's patrol partner, a younger cop named Sullivan, didn't show up for roll call. Donnelly called his apartment. No answer. He shrugged it off. Maybe the kid was sick. By the afternoon, Sullivan was found. He was alive, but barely. Someone had worked him over with precision. Broken ribs, shattered kneecap, face swollen shut. But the strange part, the part that made even hardened cops uneasy, was that Sullivan kept repeating the same thing through his broken teeth. He kept saying, "He knows everything." When they asked him who, Sullivan just shook his head and started crying. Donnelly wasn't stupid. He knew what this was. He knew Sullivan had been a message. But he was arrogant. He'd been untouchable for so long that he couldn't imagine it ending. He told himself it was some 2-bit hustler trying to scare him. He told himself he'd crack some skulls and it would blow over. He didn't go to his captain, didn't ask for backup. He just kept his service revolver close and started looking over his shoulder. The second day, Donnelly found a photograph slipped under his precinct locker. It was a picture of his daughter, 8 years old, smiling, standing outside her school in Queens. There was no note, no threat, just the picture. Donnelly's hands shook as he held it. He knew what it meant. He knew someone had been watching. Someone had been close enough to his family to take that photo, and that someone wanted him to know it. He went home early that day, told his wife they needed to visit her sister upstate for a few days. She asked why. He snapped at her, told her not to ask questions, just pack. They left that night. Donnelly thought putting distance between his family and Harlem would protect them. He was wrong. The message wasn't about his family, it was about his mind. On the third day, Donnelly was called to a disturbance in the Bronx. It was outside his usual beat, but the dispatcher said it was urgent. A body found behind a meatpacking plant. Possible homicide. Donnelly drove there alone. It was late afternoon, the sun low and red, casting long shadows across the industrial streets. The slaughterhouse loomed ahead, a hulking brick building with rusted fire escapes and broken windows. Donnelly parked his car and stepped out. The air smelled like blood and rot. He pulled his revolver and walked toward the alley. That's when he saw it. Not a body, a chair, sitting in the middle of the alley, empty, facing him. Donnelly stopped. His heart was pounding now. He knew this was wrong, knew he should leave, but his pride wouldn't let him. He stepped closer. That's when the lights went out. Not the street lights, his consciousness. Something hit him from behind, hard, fast, professional. He went down like a sack of cement. When Donnelly woke up, he was tied to the chair. His head was throbbing. His vision was blurred. He tried to move, but the ropes were tight, cutting into his wrists and ankles. The alley was dark now. The only light came from a single bulb hanging from a fire escape above him, swinging slightly, casting shifting shadows across the brick walls. Then he heard footsteps, slow, deliberate. Someone was walking toward him from the darkness. Donnelly tried to speak, tried to shout, but his mouth was dry, his voice a croak. The footsteps stopped, and then Bumpy Johnson stepped into the light. He didn't look angry, that was the worst part. He looked calm, almost serene. He was dressed in a dark suit, his hat tilted low, his hands in his pockets. He stood there for a long moment, just looking at Donnelly. Not speaking, just looking. Donnelly tried to bargain, tried to say it was a mistake, tried to offer money. Bumpy didn't respond. He just reached into his coat and pulled out a photograph. The same photograph Donnelly had found in his locker, the one of his daughter. Bumpy held it up so Donnelly could see it. Then he tore it in half, slowly, deliberately, and dropped the pieces at Donnelly's feet. What happened next would never be fully documented. There were no witnesses, no official report. But the men who worked for Bumpy, the ones who were there that night, they told stories, whispered them in bars and back rooms for decades. They said Bumpy didn't touch Donnelly, didn't hit him, didn't cut him. Instead, he talked, for hours. He described in precise, methodical detail every person Donnelly had ever hurt. Every bribe he'd taken, every lie he'd told, every life he'd ruined. And then Bumpy did something worse. He told Donnelly what was going to happen to him if he ever came near his mother again. Not death, something slower. He described how he'd dismantle Donnelly's life piece by piece, how he'd make sure his wife found out about the prostitutes he visited in the Tenderloin, how he'd plant evidence that would get him thrown off the force, how he'd make sure every gangster and hood in New York knew that Patrick Donnelly was marked, untouchable in the worst way, a walking corpse. And then Bumpy leaned in close, so close Donnelly could smell the tobacco on his breath, and he whispered something that broke the man's mind. The men who were there never repeated what Bumpy said, but whatever it was, it shattered something fundamental in Patrick Donnelly, something that couldn't be repaired. They found Donnelly the next morning. A milkman making deliveries saw him in the alley, naked, covered in his own waste, rocking back and forth, mumbling incoherently. The ropes were gone. The chair was gone. There were no marks on his body, no evidence of violence, but Donnelly was gone. Not physically, mentally. He was catatonic. When the ambulance took him to Bellevue, the doctors couldn't explain it. No head trauma, no drugs in his system. But Patrick Donnelly, a decorated 11-year veteran of the NYPD, was insane. He spent the next 6 months in a psychiatric ward. He never spoke a coherent sentence again. He never returned to duty. His wife left him. His kids grew up without knowing their father. And in the quiet corridors of Bellevue, nurses would sometimes hear him whisper the same thing over and over in his sleep. Don't let him in. Don't let the man in the dark come back. The NYPD launched an investigation. Of course they did. One of their own had been destroyed, and they wanted answers. But the investigation went nowhere. There were no witnesses, no physical evidence. Sullivan, Donnelly's partner, refused to talk, said he didn't remember anything. Other cops who'd worked with Donnelly suddenly developed amnesia. No one saw anything, no one heard anything, and the few who might have known something weren't talking because they understood the message. Bumpy Johnson had just demonstrated that a badge didn't make you untouchable, that there were lines you didn't cross, and that if you hurt the wrong person's family, all the laws and guns and authority in the world wouldn't save you. The word spread fast. Corrupt cops who'd been shaking down Harlem for years suddenly became more careful, more respectful. They still took bribes, still played their games, but they didn't put their hands on civilians the way they used to. They didn't slap old women in their kitchens, because they'd seen what happened when you did. They'd seen Patrick Donnelly drooling in a hospital bed, his eyes empty, his mind gone, and they didn't want to be next. Bumpy never spoke about what happened. Not to his associates, not to his enemies, not even to his mother. Mabel Johnson never asked. She just hugged her son a little tighter the next time she saw him, and she understood that some things didn't need to be said. The bruise on her face healed, but the memory of what her son had done to protect her, that stayed with her until the day she died. She knew her boy was dangerous, she'd always known, but she also knew he was hers, and in Harlem in 1938, that meant something. It meant loyalty. It meant protection. It meant that even in a world designed to crush people who looked like them, there were still men willing to fight back. Not with speeches or protests or petitions, but with the kind of cold, calculated justice that the system would never provide. The story of Patrick Donnelly became a legend in Harlem. Not the official version, where a cop had a mental breakdown due to stress, but the real version. The one whispered in speakeasies and barbershops and street corners. The one that reminded everyone that Bumpy Johnson wasn't just a gangster. He was a protector. A man who understood that power wasn't just about money or territory. It was about respect. And respect meant that when someone violated your family, you didn't just retaliate. You made sure they understood, on a fundamental, soul-deep level, that they'd made a mistake they could never undo. Donnelly lived another 14 years. He died in 1952, still in psychiatric care, still mumbling about the man in the dark. His death certificate listed the cause as heart failure. But the people who knew the real story, they knew better. Patrick Donnelly's heart had stopped beating the night Bumpy Johnson whispered in his ear. Everything after that was just the body catching up. Bumpy Johnson would go on to become one of the most powerful figures in Harlem's underworld. He'd survive wars with the Italian mob, federal investigations, and betrayals from people he'd once called friends. He'd spend time in prison and come out stronger. He'd mentor young hustlers who'd go on to become legends themselves. But of all the things Bumpy did in his long, violent career, the story of what happened to Patrick Donnelly remained one of the most terrifying. Because it proved something that everyone suspected, but few had seen demonstrated so completely. It proved that Bumpy Johnson didn't need to kill you to destroy you. He could do something worse. He could leave you alive, trapped inside a mind that no longer worked, reliving your worst fear over and over until the day you died. And that, more than any bullet or blade, was the kind of revenge that made men afraid. Not just of dying, but of what might happen if they crossed the wrong man and lived.